And what I expect a rational home seller to do would be, in realizing their people looking through their house at an open house have a little bit more buying power, I think they'll increase prices, and I think the benefit will be relatively short-lived.
Thanks. Finally, I think we've recently, in the last couple of years, put a ban on foreign buyers in the residential market. I'm just curious if you have any comment on that. Are we seeing any consequence or impact of that yet?
Mr. Chair, that ban is fairly limited, and so we haven't seen any real effect on housing demand from it.
I'll flip that around. What's been the impact of foreign capital in our residential markets in Canada over, say, the past 10, 15 years?
Mr. Chair, not to be overly technical, what is foreign capital is foreign capital. Certainly, it's someone who doesn't live in Canada buying a house in Canada. But
that's what I mean.
Yeah, that's low. What's driving demand for housing, though, is new Canadians coming in with financial resources who then buy a home. I don't consider that foreign capital, but it is sourced from outside Canada, and it is adding to demand for housing in Canada.
Thank you, MP Davies.
Thank you.
And now we'll hear from questions from MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony today, Mr. Rutledge. It's been very interesting. One of the things that OSFI regulates are basically the capital reserves of the banks. What I think you call the domestic stability buffer. What ordinary Canadians could kind of think of as money set aside for a rainy day. And last year I note that, I assume out of concern for the stability of the banks, you increased that requirement from 3 to 3.5%. Now, the language that you used in your report recently, calling when people refinance or have these variable rate mortgages, when their new payments get locked in, payment shock, that's very strong language. You don't use that language unless you're really concerned about something. Now, today it sounds to me like you've kind of poured a little water on that because you kind of narrowed it down to just people who are on the variable rate without locked-in payments. But I still have a couple questions. Are you concerned enough to increase the domestic stability buffer again this year? Or are you satisfied that people are coping with their payments sufficiently that you could actually reduce it back to 3%?
We intend to make an announcement on the domestic stability buffer next week, so I won't scoop myself. What I can refer
Oh, come on, just tell us.
What I can refer you to is that in December of this year, we said that the vulnerabilities had stabilized, and so there was no need to raise the buffer any further. And on empirical data, vulnerabilities have not worsened since that time.
So why use that language? It's clearly inflammatory language in a public report. Yeah, why use that language? I mean, you don't use it unless you're concerned about something. It doesn't sound like you're all that concerned based on your testimony here today.
Mr. Chair, I guess we use the language because that's how we talk about it with the institutions we regulate. That's the language they use. Now, the payment shock, the folks that are exposed to particularly acute payment shock are relatively, it's not a lot of people. I mean, 170,000 I acknowledge is too many, but there's 5 million Canadians with mortgages. And so the issue we have with that risk concentration is, it will harm Canadians. It will the Canadians who have those mortgages if they do suffer that payment shock. It'll strain the earnings of the institutions. And it is an unnecessary risk concentration that, all else equal, I would have rather avoided. And I use the term because that's what we use in the industry, to be honest.
I just want to circle back to a line of questioning that Mr. Chambers was asking about earlier. You admitted that there's an imbalance, that people with uninsured mortgages have to have their credit reassessed, and those with insured. It really is kind of backwards, when you, as Mr. Chambers pointed out, that people who have better credit and more equity in their homes have to go through that. You're saying here there's an imbalance, but at the same time you said you don't plan to do anything about it. So you're okay with a certain group of Canadians being treated unfairly when it comes to their mortgages compared to people who have insured mortgages? That's okay with you?
Mr. Chair, I'm okay with banks applying underwriting standards equivalently across the system. If we were to lighten underwriting standards vis-a-vis the MQR, well, that comes from Guideline B20, which also calls for new credits to have the collateral appraised, to have the income of the borrower checked. In other words, if you loosen one underwriting standard, you're probably going to loosen more. And our mandate calls on us to be fairly vigilant on this. My recognition that there is an imbalance from the perspective of homeowners who have insured versus uninsured, I hold to. It is, from the perspective of those home buyers, if I were a home buyer facing that, I would feel like it was an imbalance. The commissioner of the Competition Bureau and I have spoken about that. And I think it is a legitimate challenge to say to OSFI, can you do something different so that imbalance goes away? We are thinking about it, and I think it's a fair critique.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Morantz. Okay, for our final 5 minutes for the superintendent, we've got MP Sorbara, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome everyone. And Peter, nice to see you again. I think if I age you and age myself, we would go back about, say, 12 years. And I know you've had a number of roles from being a bank analyst at Moody's and now to this position at OSFI. So congratulations on your career path and your appointments. Very well deserved. I still remember listening to you on the conference call, on the bank analyst conference calls with the bank earnings, and I was on the bond side and you were on the equity side. Peter, the one thing that we know about the banking industry and with regards to liquidity and funding, and we know when there's a banking crisis, it always comes down to liquidity and funding, and you can even take that to the consumer side as well. I've read the annual report and I've sort of schemed over it and stuff. On the funding and liquidity risk side, what's your view on that with regards to the Canadian banking system?
Mr. Chair, we had a stress test of that in 2023, and I don't think it'd be right to say I'm surprised, but I was certainly reassured that during that period, Canadian banks, by and large, were safe haven investments. In other words, they tended to see positive inflows. And that would extend to smaller and medium-sized banks who to be candid, we had extra vigilance over, and we saw very stable funding flows to those institutions. So a safe, regulated system with a lot of capital and liquidity buffers is viewed by international investors as a safe haven system, and it's an asset that I want to do my part to protect.
Okay. With regards to digitization and any sort of, digital currency, open banking, portability, what of those things, if I can use it in this term, keeps you up at night and makes you think about, because OSFI has a mandate, you can try to quantify risks, and that's the best way we can do with arrears and so forth and domestic stability buffers. But on that side there, how should we as legislators think about that side?
The risk that keeps me up at night is you'll get unregulated business models emerge that compete directly with regulated institutions. For example, there are some stablecoin arrangements that, when I look at their balance sheet, look an awful lot to me like banks. They take deposits for a very short period of time and they make long-term investments. Those institutions, if they have that balance sheet that looks like a bank, they should be regulated like a bank, and that's what keeps me up.
And I also would like to, I want to add on that, if there's asset liability mismatch on those balance sheets, that would obviously be a cause for concern, would it not?
Mr. Chair, one needs only look at the crypto winter or the case of Silicon Valley Bank to answer affirmatively yes to that.
Okay. If Chair, just please cut me off when my time is up. One final question. Arrears in Canada. We know that Canadians, we know their mortgage debt is backed by an asset. It's a very good asset. The arrears, the trends, if I had to qualify them and say they are very stable, would that be a fair term?
Mr. Chair, I wouldn't use very stable. I would use very low and deteriorating incrementally and not dramatically.
Thank you, Chair. I'll stop there and turn it over.
Okay, well, thank you, MP Sorbara, and we want to thank Superintendent Rutledge. Thank you very much for coming before Finance Committee on our housing study, and we wish you the best with the rest of your day. Thank you. Appreciate it. Members, we'll suspend now as we transition into our second. We are back with our second panel on policy decisions and market forces that have led to increases in the cost of buying or renting a home in Canada. And with us for our second panel, we have from BMO Bank of Montreal, and we've got Mr. Robert Kavcic, who's a senior economist there. Welcome. From members, we are having technical challenges, I understand, with Desjardins Group, and Monsieur Jimmy Jean may not be able to be with us for this panel. And from the Royal Bank of Canada, we have Assistant Chief Economist Robert Hogue. Welcome, Mr. Hogue. From Scotiabank, Vice President, Head Inclusion, Resilience Economics, Rebecca Young is with us. And from TD Bank Group, economist for TD Economics, Rishi Sontai. So welcome. And with that, we're going to hear first for opening remarks from Mr. Kavcic, and for up to 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable members. Thank you for the invitation to appear at the House of Commons Finance Committee. My name is Robert Kavcic, senior economist, BMO, covering analysis of housing market issues in Canada. And my remarks and commentary today come from that perspective as a macroeconomist on the housing market. So housing affordability, I think, is pretty clearly a significant economic and social issue, and largely reflects the imbalance between demand and supply in the market. And so by most measures, housing affordability hasn't been this difficult from the perspective of a new homebuyer since 1990. Rent growth has also accelerated well in excess of income growth. And looking back at these measures, affordability, I would say, has really become an acute problem over the past 3 years or so. And in fact, when you look at our affordability measure that accounts for income, interest rates, home prices, it was more or less right in line with the 40-year average as recently as 2019. So the question is what has changed in that short period to cause a major supply-demand imbalance and drive such a dramatic deterioration in affordability? And I think one popular narrative is that Canada just isn't building enough homes, but my takeaway from the housing data, from the labor market metrics, and speaking with industry participants across the country in home building, is that the industry has been running at pretty well full capacity. So in other words, we're already building almost all of the housing that we possibly can, just in a natural response to market conditions. In the 5 years through 2019, just as an example, housing completions have averaged just over 190,000 units. And in the last 3 years, as affordability was deteriorating, housing completions rose by about 20%. The current number of units under construction is at a record high in absolute terms, or if you adjust it in per capita terms. So the supply side of the market isn't getting worse. It's just a matter of not being able to keep up to demand. So part of that demand growth is fundamental. We have very strong demographic demand from the millennial cohort. At the same time, we've seen international immigration rise from about 450,000 per year before the pandemic to almost 1.2 million people in the past year. And this is a historic demand shock that does present a challenge to infrastructure, including housing. Now, to be very clear on this, I do believe that there are long-run benefits to a robust international immigration program, and they are significant and they should be maintained. And we've shown an ability to meet housing demand created by that robust permanent resident program. But an additional 800,000 non-permanent residents in the past year has pretty clearly been difficult for the market to absorb on the supply side. And that is acutely reflected in surging rents. And then separately on the demand side, interest rates were cut to historic lows when the Bank of Canada was easing during the pandemic shock and until they began tightening policy in March of 2022. And of course, deeply negative real interest rates drove outsized gains in house prices, which itself bred some speculative psychology in the market. And that market psychology drove prices well in excess of underlying income, interest rate, and demographic fundamentals, which we think are the root of house prices longer term. So higher interest rates have since broken that psychology and have pulled prices down by 20% or more in some markets, but affordability won't necessarily improve until rates fall further, prices fall further, or incomes are allowed to gradually catch up over time. And they are, but it takes time. So putting this all together, I think in summary, the demand supply imbalance in housing has been created most acutely by surging demand. And the supply side is really doing all it can to keep up. So measures to improve the responsiveness of housing construction are certainly encouraged. The demand curve, though, seems like it is much easier to move in the short run. And so appropriately calibrating demand to match our ability to provide adequate housing supply over time is probably where we have the biggest and importantly most achievable impact on affordability pressure in the near term. So thank you for the opportunity to provide opening remarks. I'll be pleased to answer any questions later on.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kavcik. And now we'll hear from Mr. Hogue from RBC.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be speaking to you today. And it's always a curse of going second because a lot of the points that were raised beforehand totally are part of my opening remarks here. But what I would add is...
Not to interrupt, Mr. Hogue. Yeah, we're having some challenges with your mic or headset, or we're getting a lot of cracking coming through. How are the interpreters?
Okay.
No. If you can unplug and then replug in your headset, see if that will help. If you could just do a little test.
For now?
If you could keep speaking.
All right.
No, I think it's still,
right.
it's the quality is very poor and it's not possible. So I'm sorry, Mr. Hogue, but we're not going to be able to hear from you. Now we'll go to Scotiabank members, and we'll hear from Rebecca Young, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to provide comments today. My name is Rebecca Young. I'm a Vice President, Head of Inclusion and Resilience Economics in Scotiabank Economics. I'll be providing perspectives from a macroeconomist perspective, but also in my role, I provide thought leadership on sustainable economic growth by taking a longer-term look at structural forces impacting Canadian welfare. So clearly, housing is one of those issues. Now, housing affordability in Canada has clearly been on a path of deterioration over the past few years, but the erosion of affordability has been going on for decades now. And market forces have been a big part of this story. And picking up on some of what my colleagues said, household income has been actually a positive story, is that household income for the average Canadian household has been outpacing inflation fairly consistently over the past few decades. This has increased their purchasing power. And while interest rates are currently high, they have been trending down structurally for decades, so making it cheaper for Canadians to finance homes over time. And again, increasing their purchasing power. Demographics are another obvious side of the demand equation, and this includes both a growing population but also an aging population. And so what we see is that the occupancy, or the number of individuals per household, has been declining over the past few decades. And as a result, the demand for homes has in fact outstripped population growth over the past few decades. And I would just note on aging, because we are aging as a society in Canada, it's important to acknowledge that many more Canadians want to age in place. And in some cases, the alternatives like downsizing to a condo can in fact be more costly than staying in place, even if it means more bedrooms sitting empty. Now, supply no doubt has been a major binding constraint against these demand and demographic driven forces. Again, looking past, the last few years, rather look at the past few decades, there has been an erosion of the elasticity, or the responsiveness of supply to housing demand. And the reasons are numerous, well documented elsewhere, from regulatory to zoning issues to escalating development charges. Labor is another one of the challenges, that despite record high number of workers in the construction industry, the number of homes that we're building in Canada has not substantially changed on a trend basis. And we see CMHC has attributed this both to productivity declines in the sector, as well as regulatory hurdles along the way in a very highly fragmented sector. But the net effect is that it is taking longer and it is more costly to build homes of all types in Canada today. But returning to the bigger picture, that all of these factors have been amplified over the past 3 years to push what's been a slow burning affordability path to an acute one. And there is no panacea to restoring affordability. That we do think priorities should be placed on supply, with a broad definition to include related housing infrastructure. And that care is needed when we look at demand side measures, given the risk of further exacerbating affordability. And we should also be noting changing societal preferences and needs being taken into consideration. So, Canada should be able to slow the acceleration of home prices over time, but this is going to take concerted and coordinated action across all levels of government and collaboratively with private sector and social purpose organizations. However, even if the home price appreciation is slowed or even decelerates modestly, there will be a subset of Canadians, namely lower fixed income Canadians, for whom appropriate shelter will still be unaffordable. Canada will likely need targeted solutions here. And I'll just elaborate very briefly on this point, that we did publish a paper last year titled "Canadian Housing Affordability Hurts," which has been raised by this committee a few times. I just underscore that a key finding was that still first best solutions involve dismantling supply barriers and harnessing market forces to massively scale up housing across the market-based spectrum. However, that trickle-down effect will not reach, or at least fast enough, a small subset of Canadians with little or no market income under most reasonable paths. And those gaps are wider than governments can reasonably alleviate through transfers alone on an ongoing basis. And that a do-nothing scenario is also not fiscally appropriate, as the knock-on effect on other social infrastructure, from shelters to hospital beds to prisons, are even more costly than the provision of subsidized or social housing. I would reinforce, though, that the paper makes the case that it's not either or, it's not social or market housing, and it's not to avoid a polarization of public versus private provision, rather about the right mix that would serve all Canadians. And so just, stepping back, that I would point out through an economic lens, housing is part of a bigger system, and there are trade-offs and opportunities to consider. That income, investment, and capital that goes into housing is income, investment, and capital not going elsewhere, and these do warrant full deliberation. And just as a final point, also note that Canada is not unique, that home prices to income as a ratio for Canada are about middle of the pack relative to OECD peers. So more responsive supply is first best, but we may need to consider more broadly how markets are structured to ensure suitable, adequate, and affordable shelter for Canadians without stifling the economic growth drivers that ultimately secure welfare gains. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Young. And now we'll go to our final witness before questions, and that is from TD Bank Group, Mr. Sondheim, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My comments, my opening statement will be brief relative to my fellow panelists. Hi, my name is Rishi Sandhi, and I'm an economist at TD Bank. I'm the economics group's housing market expert, and I'm responsible for publishing research on housing and generating quarterly forecasts for home resales, average home prices in the resale market, and housing starts. The TD Economics team's last official forecast was in March 2024, and we're right in the middle of updating our projection, which will be published on June 18th. However, briefly, I can say that conditions in housing markets have evolved broadly as we had anticipated in March during the spring season. Lastly, I'd like to say that views expressed today represent those of myself and the TD Economics team, but do not necessarily represent the views of TD Bank more generally. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sandhi. And so we've had some technical challenges. So if there are any questions for Mr. Hogue, I would ask that you could pose the question, and Mr. Hogue, you could send those questions to the committee in writing. That's what can be done at this time. So, members, we're going to get into questions right now. In the first round, I have MP Morantz for the first 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the economists for being here today. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ms. Young. The government of Canada announced in its budget that it's going to be increasing the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66 2/3%. They've just introduced legislation to make that happen this morning, or yesterday morning. From an economist perspective, do you think that the capital gains changes proposed by the Liberal government will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Maybe what I'll, I haven't seen details of the legislation, so maybe what I will talk more broadly about is the impact of the costs of some of the headwinds to supply right now, and so very obviously a big one right now are high interest rates. So that has been adding.
I hate to interrupt, but I have a fairly focused issue that I'd like to try and get a response on. The government has said they're increasing the capital gains inclusion rate, which means that builders will pay more tax in capital gains when they go and sell the projects that they built. From an economist's perspective, doesn't that put a damper on risk-taking in terms of building new residential projects? Aside from knowing the details of the legislation, just in principle, as an economist, don't you think that increasing the capital gains tax would make it less likely that someone might build an apartment building or attractive homes?
We certainly know right now in the industry that that development charges are a very big component. Some cite anywhere from 20 to 30% of the cost of new supply, and so that certainly, as a big chunk of what it costs to build, has been a deterrent to new supply.
Mr. Kavich, maybe I'll try the same question with you. Do you think the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in the context of overall investment activity within real estate, there is potentially an impact either when sellers look to list properties in advance of a tax change, or if the long-term economics of a tax increase alter the expectations of return going forward. So whether, and I personally haven't seen the exact details of the legislation either, so I don't want to comment too deeply on it. Also, real estate's a very long-dated asset, so the impact may or may not be as significant as in some other asset classes. And more broadly speaking, I think as an investment asset class today, macroeconomic conditions are playing the overriding factor here because interest rates have increased, expectations of house price growth have decreased, and current levels of rental yield don't stack up very well to risk-free government assets. So as an investment asset class today, real estate has kind of fallen back in terms of overall activity. So how a capital gains tax change fits in that broader context of weakening activity already would be very hard to flesh out and put a precise estimate on, I would think.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question maybe a little bit of a different way. If you were going to advise the government on the type of policy they should bring in to deal with the housing crisis, which is what this this committee is studying right now and is why you're here, would you suggest to them that increasing the capital gains tax would be one of those policies?
I don't, Mr. Speaker, with all honesty, I don't want to project the impact of a specific tax measure that I haven't fully studied in this context.
Okay, Mr. Sondy, quickly with you, same question. Do you think that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Yeah, so we wrote on this. We released a report that was sort of a fulsome take on the latest federal housing plan, and the capital gains inclusion rate was rolled into that report. And in it, we said that the impact would be highly uncertain. It's difficult to know now because we don't know. We don't have a line of sight with respect to how the legislation will be fully rolled out. But there's some risk that it'll be a negative factor for investment moving forward, which would potentially weigh on rental supply. That's a potential impact. Again, we have to wait to see how the details sort of roll out and wait to see how the market reacts to the information. In the resale market, our thought was that it could cause a near-term boost in listings and supply as potential sellers work to get ahead of the June 25th deadline, which could supply some modest downward pressure on average home prices in the near term.
Thank you.
Morantz, and now we're going to MP Zerowitz, and I guess you're sharing your time with MP Thompson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I will be asking one question and then passing the baton for the rest of my time to Ms. Thompson. First, I want to start off by saying thanks to all the economists who've presented today, and I apologize that Mr. Hogue wasn't, I'm very sad that Mr. Hogue wasn't able to present to us, but we'll move forward. First, I want to just state very clearly that we have heard a number of testimony at a number of different meetings that for over 30 years, it was the lack of investment of all three levels of government who didn't do enough to continue to build homes in Canada that has led to the current housing crisis. Now, I'm very proud our federal government has released a very comprehensive housing plan. It's a plan that's going to be building more single homes. It's going to be building more rental homes, and it's going to be putting far more investments to ensure there is deeply affordable housing that is created. But it's going to take more than just all three levels of government investing. And so my question is to Ms. Young, what role do you see banks have in potential solutions to the housing crisis?
Just before Ms. Young goes, I'll just stop the time because we have got Mr. Hogue. We're just going to test really quickly to see if it's possible. If you could just start speaking.
All right. Hopefully this time you can hear me okay without any noise in my microphone.
I'll look to the interpreters, see if you could raise your boom on your headset. Yes.
How's that? Is that a little better now?
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so Mr. Hogue is also available, and now back to well, you got the question from MP Zerowitz, yeah.
Okay.
But it was to
Ms. Young.
To Ms. Young, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. First I would, separate two separate issues from obviously banks provide capital. They provide capital to individuals to buy homes and also capital to developers to produce homes. Right now you also have to think of demand. And so what we heard from earlier testimonies were around the rules and regulations that, for example, chartered banks are subject to around the kind of risk-adjusted provision of capital for these activities versus the demand that's out there. And so I think, banks obviously, the banks that we represent have a very big role through both of these channels in, both helping Canadians purchase homes and helping project developers build them. I think what we've seen, including from the economics department, is that we have taken more of an advocacy role in the policy space as well, weighing into looking at some of the issues, some of the numbers in terms of kind of that longer term trajectory that we're on, and looking for, policy solutions that benefit, all Canadians, because a thriving economy is good for Canadians. It's good for banks.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Thank you.
There I am. Thank you. And see how many questions I can get into my time. And I thank my colleague for sharing her time. Mr. Hoke, I have to go to you, and I'm delighted we were able to solve the technical issues. In your view, could you speak to the committee and certainly Canadians about your perspective on what led to the housing crisis and the different elements that we need to address in order to move through this predicament? And in a specific lens with the elements is also the all-of-government approach, one being the focus on labor force and really expanding skill sets in the housing construction sector. Thank you.
Right. And this housing crisis, I mean, has been, I would argue, decades in the making in some parts of the country. Before the pandemic already, there was a tremendous stress in the Toronto and Vancouver area, for example. But what happened during the pandemic is that stress really spread out across Canada. And now you can arguably say that what we have is a national housing crisis and no longer localized. Now, and fundamentally, as was said before, it is an imbalance between demand and supply, and the supply side has been unable to adjust or respond quickly enough to that very strong demand that we've had over the last many years. And so our view is that the policy side should continue to focus, and we're happy to see that all levels of government now are talking about the supply side, but we need to grow the housing stock in Canada to accommodate all that demand. And when I say housing stock here, I mean the entire spectrum. This is not just on the ownership side. This is also on the rental side. This is also on the social housing side. So we need to address this nationwide issue now. On a big push to grow that housing stock to accommodate that demand.
Thank you. And actually, I really appreciate the language around spectrum. And to Ms. Young, you as well, you spoke around housing in a continuum. And we really need to be mindful of the needs for social housing as well as market and everything in between. I'm going to ask you both quickly, if you could speak to the cultural changes needed to really ensure that we do everything we can to address the housing challenge, but what it looks like in urban areas, how we live in our places, how we look at shared space, how we look at the way that we live within our space. I know I'm running out of time, but a quick answer from both of you around what we need to look at culturally as well to ensure that every Canadian has the right to dignified spaces to live.
Do I go first on this one? I think especially in the urban areas, we're talking about more denser housing, and that means the more housing in terms of footprint, so a higher in addressing the missing middle, so kind of a mid-size housing, so space will be more limited. And this is where I think Canadians, especially in urban areas, will have to adjust their housing expectations.
Young.
Yeah, if I can just very briefly pick up on that, I think, one is, first of all, using the footprint that we have already, and that builds on the densification, but also the infrastructure that's out there. I think we also have to figure out, we are a very decentralized country, and so we have to figure out how to make that work, because a lot of the needs are going to be local, and that, on the ground, that's where, whether it's even local government or local nonprofits that are going to be able to best identify the specific needs and their culturally appropriate needs. So those would be two quick thoughts.
Thank you, MP Thompson. And now we're going to go to MP Trudell, please.
Merci, Mr. Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First quick question, Mr. Kachik. I arrived at the last minute, but I heard you say something that intrigued me. You said, I think, that we in Canada had reached our maximum construction capacity right now. And that's a problem, because we know that in 2023 in Quebec, only 39 housing units were built. In 2021, 77,000. So we seem to be backtracking. So how can we improve our overall capacity to build housing units?
Great, thank you for the question. So I agree. When you look at the Quebec numbers or the Canadian numbers broadly, we have counterintuitively seen new construction activity actually fall over the last 2 years, despite our push to continually build more. And part of that is the reality that we just have broad macroeconomic conditions that ultimately dictate what the market does. And when you have a very aggressive tightening cycle that triggers a decline in housing activity and a pullback in investment activity, you're naturally going to see a market response where construction falls. So it's very difficult to push home builders to, first of all, build in an environment that's not favorable for them or perhaps offers them a lot of risk going forward. And it's also very difficult to, when you have an industry that is already at capacity, to push further beyond those constraints. So in terms of a policy response, I mean, I fully agree with my colleagues that any kind of measures that can improve the elasticity of supply or the responsiveness of supply or the productivity with which we build housing is absolutely a positive for this country and for housing supply going forward, because it can make this market dynamic play out faster. And keep in mind that home builders take time to bring projects to market and to bring units to completion. So if we have an acute demand shock on the ground today, it might be 2, 3, 4 years before we actually complete units to satiate that demand and bring rents back down to a more appropriate level. So any measures on the supply side in that context, I think are very, very important avenues to keep pushing on.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sandi, you did a study that said that we needed to build 3.8 million housing units to come back to a certain level of affordability. So there are two housing crises in one. I think there's an accessibility issue to obtain housing and affordability, to be able to afford housing. So now I see that the federal programs, and I was told throughout Quebec when I did a tour, is that federal programs are on affordability. So it's to create housing at 80% of the market rate, but we, the taxpayers, were paying to build units at $1,300 in Longueuil, and that seems unacceptable. And 4.5 are costing more in Montreal, and we're paying. So this is for rich people. We're paying for our taxes. So it's not just an idea of building housing units. We have to be very targeted. Social housing, something that people can afford, $600, $800. So how can we solve this, Mr. Sandi?
Right. So with respect to overall housing affordability, I would share some of the views of Mr. Kavchik in that. One, I would say, relatively quickish way that we could sort of handle that would be to work on the demand side. We could slow population growth because in the past few years, population growth has been quite strong. So we could implement measures to slow population growth and bring it more in line with fundamental demand. One factor that I'll touch on as well is construction productivity. So productivity in the construction industry, according to Statistics Canada, lags that of other industries, and it's my belief that that's not a very well studied phenomenon. So I would dedicate some resources towards studying that, because we can improve. If we can improve construction sector productivity, we can boost housing supply without having to bring in more individuals. Of course, another pillar to address labor supply would be, in fact, bringing in more individuals, and that would help. That would help, sort of in that respect. So those are the levers that I would pull to help with respect to housing affordability. I think that would, those would bear fruit.
Question connexe, en fait, les pays.
A supplementary question. So the best performing countries in Europe with regards to the housing crisis, we have France, Austria, and these countries have a larger proportion of housing outside of the market, public, so social housing, also co-ops. In France, over 20% of all of the rental stock is outside of the market. In Canada, it's less than 5%, so we're really far from that. Do you think it would be a goal? I know that the Minister of Housing has an objective of 8% of social housing. Well, of course, that won't be achieved in the next year. I think it's a lacking ambition. Could we be inspired with those countries and try to have a larger amount of our rental stock to be social housing?
I think that's a fair point, given the affordability challenges that we see in the current environment. I will note that the latest federal budget had earmarked some funds towards offering low cost loans for prefabricated units and for student housing and the like, and some investments in the Affordable Housing Fund, for example, right? So there is some movement in that respect. I do think the point that you make is fair, but I will note that my expertise has more to do with I would say other types of housing starts, detached, semi-detached, towns and rows and the like, and not so much in the affordable housing space, unfortunately.
Okay. Merci, MP Trudel. And now to MP Davies for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Maybe I'll address this to Ms. Young, if I could. In September 2022, the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate released a series of research reports that explore the growing trend of financial firms using housing as a commodity to grow wealth for their investors. The reports confirmed this phenomenon, known as the financialization of housing, is contributing to unaffordable rent increases, worsening conditions, and a rise in evictions. They note that the greatest impact of this is on disadvantaged groups such as seniors, low-income tenants, people with disabilities, recent immigrants, and lone parent families. They estimate that about 1/3 of all seniors housing in Canada has been financialized, along with 20 to 30% of purpose-built rental buildings. What policy? First of all, do you agree with that, and are you concerned by it? And what policy responses, if any, do you think the federal government should take towards, I guess, organizations like REITs and others that are financializing residential housing?
So I published a report early last year where we did say the government should set a target for social housing. So we did see that there was a real issue of Canadians, particularly fixed income, that aren't on market income, for whom housing affordability is going to be elusive regardless of what policies are or aren't taken on the market side. So we do think that we need to double the stock. Now, when we use the term social housing, we see it still requires all parties. It requires private sector, it requires nonprofit, it requires government, and so but it becomes a different mix of what roles, and there are distinct roles between providing the financing versus if it's construction or renovation, versus the operations and managing at the individual level. And so if we look at the social housing space, for example, one very positive development has been in British Columbia, and now the federal government is moving in this direction. But basically the acquisition fund idea. So we do have a lot of aging stock that, if it is going to be upgraded, renovated at market rates, it is likely going to be higher, higher value, higher rent.
If I could, Ms. Young, though, I want to focus on sort of the REITs. I'm going to go to social housing. You've anticipated where I want to go next. But I know that REITs, for instance, don't pay any corporate income tax. But do you see any, is there, I think, a sound policy basis to try to curb this trend towards increasing financialization of housing? That's really what my specific question is.
I think that we should be looking at how to leverage capital markets to build more housing supply across the spectrum, and that we also need to have a very focused, specific strategy at the social end, because it isn't driven by market forces. Mm-hmm. And I do see a role that a number of these aging structures are with REIT companies, and so I think that there is a role to harness.
Now, your quote was, market price housing will likely never be affordable for a serious share of households. That was your quote in your 2023 report. Can you quantify that for me, please? What's a serious share of households?
Sorry, apologies.
Oh, I was just going to say, how many are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Chair, so in this report, what I looked at was the income quintile renters. So the really acute situation right now are in renters, because normally in an economic cycle, what happens, when home prices, interest rates are high, we see more people going into rent, and rent is a more kind of a relief valve. It's a cheaper option. But what is very unique about this cycle is that rent, because of that population influx, hasn't been that relief valve. And so, so consequently, where the real vulnerability and the affordability crunches are in those renter Canadians. I quantified it looking at the bottom two income quintile renters. So if you think a third of, Canadians are renters, well, 2/5 of that, so we are, and those tend to be, a third of those that, so it is a material number of Canadians, and it is the ones that are not securely attached to the workforce, so that
right. I probably should have continued your quote. You said, and easily those in the lowest income quintile, based on current trajectories, you've now raised sort of maybe the two lowest income quintiles. So we're talking 40% of Canadians.
It's sorry, a third. We're talking more, about 10%, I think, is a good number. That is a number that would be classified as core housing need. So 10% of Canadian households.
Okay. Now, I wanted to move into social housing. You also, in the same report, said, quote, Canada's current stock of social housing defined as subsidized rental units is among the lowest across OECD peers at just 3.5% of total dwellings. Can you situate us in terms of our OECD peers? And maybe sort of give us some context for that. If we're at 3.5%, what is a sort of an example of a good OECD member peer who is doing better? What kind of percentage do they have?
So, at the very high end, we have, kind of in the double digits from, 20, 30%. At the low end, we've certainly got, half the OECD peers lower. I would say that the market constructs are quite different. So, what we didn't, we admit it's very simplistic to say we're very mediocre, if not poor, relative to OECD. We said double. Again, there wasn't a lot of science behind that, other than we really have to do something here, is that market forces aren't going to work for these Canadians. Doubling, is pretty ambitious. It's a start. It's not likely going to solve all the problems, but we have to start thinking about it. We have to start thinking about this sector.
So in that same report,
MP Davies, that was we're over time, but we are going. We're transitioning. We're going into our second round. It'll be a truncated round, but members. Mr. Hogue from the Royal Bank of Canada was not able to give his opening remarks. I think we'd want that on record. So if you're ready, Mr. Hogue, your opening remarks, if you could just deliver those to the committee members, because of technical difficulties, we couldn't do it at the start. Yeah.
Right. It's not as much as whether I'm ready or whether the microphone is ready. Yes, but I mean, I think it is clear by now that Canada is in a housing crisis. It is now a nationwide issue, and no longer an issue that's localized in the high expensive markets in GTA and in Vancouver. And a lot happened, and that essentially a perfect storm occurred during the pandemic, where you had housing needs that changed very, very quickly. The policy response to the health crisis and provided tremendous firepower for a lot of households to buy homes, at least in the initial part of it. The Bank of Canada cut interest rates. So all this really stirred a fire for housing demand and caused home prices to spike. The home prices that increased more than 50% nationwide in the space of 24 months. And then once inflation really flared up, the Bank of Canada hiked interest rate in a historic way. That from a home ownership perspective, now got this double whammy of higher prices and a higher interest rate that really hammered housing affordability. So today, this is what we're dealing with: home ownership affordability that's that is now that got away from many Canadians who are many of them now aren't pushed into the rental market. That's created tremendous pressure on rent. And vacancy rates have reached historical lows. So it is a very broad-based issue that we're dealing with, very complicated, and so we'll need a very concerted effort to address this issue from all levels of government.
Thank you, Mr. Hogue. Okay, so members, I'm looking at the time. We did have some interruptions. We'll go a little bit over each party, 3 to 4 minutes. Okay, so we'll start with MP Lawrence for the first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be splitting my time with Mr. Epp, but Ms. Young, I'd just like to put actually a quote that you gave on a podcast not too long ago, and just want to make sure you agree with it. It's specifically with respect to the capital gains. You seemed unwilling to go into those waters despite my question or Mr. Moran's questions, but you did before, and I just wanted to confirm that you feel the same way. You said, and I quote here, and yet we have measures like this that are clearly punitive to investment in Canada. You're talking about capital gains. So it is a big change. And the signal probably doesn't sit well with a lot of folks in terms of what it means for competitiveness and agility of Canada's landscape. Do you still agree with those comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. And yes, I still agree with those. I agree with my other colleagues' comments made as well. You know, first of all, situating in the bigger picture of what are creating some of the headwinds and the uncertainty around it. I'd also go back to my, opening points about seeing housing as a system. And this is one example where, we do need to look overall at our tax structure.
Thank you. My time is limited, especially since I'm splitting with Mr. Epp. But I just want to, if I could just get a brief answer to this, do you believe, as I do, that a capital gains taxation is unhelpful? A capital gains increase is unhelpful?
I think certainly the signal is negative in that we need to look more broadly at our tax system to reorient it towards growth enhancements.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I'll give the rest of my time over to Mr. Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at this time, I'd like to move the following motion: that the committee order a fully redacted copy, the government's economic analysis on the impact of the federal fuel charge and the output-based pricing system, referred as Reference Information Request IR0776 in the Department of Environment and Climate Change's Canada's letter to the parliamentary officer dated May 14th, 2024. And given that this information is already produced, the committee order this file within 24 hours of this motion being adopted and report this finding to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, MP Epp. And I've got MP Lawrence, then MP Baker to speak to this.
Thank you. And I'm hoping this will be a relatively quick discussion and we can move to a vote and carry forward with what I believe has been some excellent testimony. Of course, we heard in conversation or in discussion with Mr. Yves Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, that in fact there exists a report that, at least in accordance with Mr. Giroux's comments, would validate his findings that 6 out of 10 Canadians are paying more into the carbon tax than receiving. I should point out that the Liberals do say 8 out of 10, but they only tell half the story, as is often the case. That 8 out of 10 is only with respect to financial or direct payments. When taken in account the economic or the indirect payments, and by what do we mean by that? We mean the cost the carbon tax adds to trucking the food, that adds to farmers, that all funnel its way down to eventually the Canadian consumer, that, as Mr. Giroux said, the majority of Canadians will face a net loss. And one question as to, of course, he did make a clarification on the 17th, and when asked by the PS, the parliamentary secretary for finance, how he knew that his numbers were correct, he said, well, they were the same as yours, which was quite telling. And then Mr. Morantz, an excellent round of questions, asked him to confirm that there was a report. He confirmed that there was a report, and further, he went as far enough to say that there was a gag order which restricted him from providing the full analysis. So, you know what? I
Appel
haven't.
au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
C'est quoi ce gag order? J'ai oublié.
Étant donné
Point of order. The number of given the amount of people that would like to speak on the motion, I'm asking to free the witnesses.
Yep. Members, yeah, I think that may be a good idea because I do have MP Lawrence, MP Baker, MP Somebody, MP Zerowitz, and then MP Morantz on my list. So on that, we do want to thank Mr. Hulk, Mr. Sondi, Mr. Kavsik, and Miss and I apologize here. Miss Young, yes, Miss Young. So thank you so much for coming before our committee on this housing study and for all the information that you've provided committee members. And we wish you the best with the rest of your day. So you're released. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so members to our list.
I'll conclude shortly because I want to give the courtesy of allowing a response, and also hopefully we can get right to a vote. And so I would just conclude by saying transparency is the best disinfectant. And so if this report does exist, as Mr. Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, states it does, and it does validate Conservatives' conclusion that carbon tax is causing Canadians to suffer a net loss, I would respectfully ask that that we all vote yes and get this report to our committee.
Okay, thank you, MP Lawrence. I'm going to MP Baker now.
I was on the list.
You are on the list. Yeah, I've got MP Baker, MP Somebody, MP Zerowitz, MP Morantz, MP Sorbara. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Chair, I'm noting the time that we're almost at the end of our meeting, 1 o'clock. But I also wanted to note that, just recently, all parties came to an agreement on the work that this committee would do going forward, the issues that we would study, how we would allocate our time. And we came together on a programming motion. For those watching at home, that basically means a motion that lays out the plan of where we're going to spend our time, what we're going to study. So given we had that plan and agreed to, I think we should remain focused and stick to that plan. I think this is a